I'm Eloy Ortiz Oakley, President and CEO of College Futures Foundation, and you're invited to Opportunity Forum with College Futures. Hi, everyone. For this episode of Opportunity Forum with College Futures, we're focused on college student mental health and well-being. Today, I'm passing the mic over to April Yee, one of our incredible senior program officers here at College Futures Foundation. April has been leading our work on holistic student supports and mental health, and I'm excited for her to host today's conversations with our special guests. So for now, over to you, April.
Thanks, Eloy. Today on Opportunity Forum with College Futures, we're asking and answering the very real question: who is responsible for addressing college student mental health? My name is Dr. April Yee, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at College Futures Foundation. I'm joined today by Dr. Tiffany Herbert, the Associate Vice President for Health and Wellbeing at CSU Dominguez Hills, who is also a licensed psychologist, and Dr. Lindsay Pérez Huber, an acclaimed researcher, author, and professor at CSU Long Beach. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so before we dive in, let me just set the stage for why we're even asking this question: who is responsible for the mental health and well-being of college students? So first, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we are seeing a movement led by this younger generation to destigmatize talking about mental health. So with increasing media coverage of this issue, in fact, public health crisis, and higher ed faculty and staff struggling with mental health challenges of their own, there's a growing awareness and concern, yet at the same time, perhaps a growing sense that this is just too big or too overwhelming to really tackle systemically, or at least for higher ed to tackle systemically. I think the three of us here today do believe that it is possible to tackle, and that in fact higher ed is well positioned to do something about this issue. And so I'm really glad that we're here together today to have this conversation. I think we see it a bit differently than others. Lindsay co-authored a new report that College Futures just released titled Degrees of Distress, that really examines through an equity lens the ways in which higher ed institutions harm and help heal their students. Tiffany is leading a project to expand mental health supports for students at 5 CSU campuses in the LA region, known as the CSU 5 Mental Health Initiative, which College Futures is funding. And I lead the foundation's work around holistic student supports, which is grounded in the belief that higher ed institutions are responsible for supporting student success, and students' academic success is inextricably linked to their well-being. So that's why we're here. That's why we're having this conversation. And let's get started by first just talking about how you all understand the challenge or the issue of college student mental health. So I'm going to start first with Lindsay. Lindsay, you write in the Degrees of Distress report, despite the profound impact that the pandemic had on society's collective well-being, mental health challenges were widespread and becoming progressively worse prior to the pandemic. So what are the challenges that you're referring to here? And what's been the role of higher education in perpetuating these challenges really for years, not just within the last few?
Thanks, April. So one of the goals that my co-author, Dr. Sam Musaeus, and I thought about with this report was to connect a discussion about mental health in higher education to broader societal issues. That was something that was really important for us. So one of them being, of course, the mental health crisis that has emerged nationally in recent years. So for example, in our work, we found a study that reported 9 out of 10 adults in the US believe that we are in fact in a mental health crisis. And 1 out of 5 adults rate their own mental health as only fair or poor. So we've seen the serious consequences of declining mental health play out across the nation in the last decade through things like the opioid crisis that's happening across the nation. And in the report, we talk about increased rates in violent crime, suicide, and the mass shootings that we seem to see every week now in our country. And these things can all be linked to mental health. Healthy people, healthy of the mind and healthy of the body, don't engage in these behaviors. So if we understand higher education as a system that then reflects the challenges that we see present in society, we see those same trends in mental health nationally that are playing out also show up in our colleges, in our universities. So in our report, we talk about research that's found the majority of college students in the United States just a few years ago in 2021 have reported experiencing at least one mental health challenge during their undergraduate careers. And other studies have shown that rates of things like depression and anxiety reported by college students have exponentially increased in recent years. And so we know that this increase has also occurred unevenly across demographic groups. So another goal that we had in writing this report was connecting broader systemic inequities, like those we're seeing between the 4 years in the community college, to the discussion of college student mental health. So we found that college students from historically underrepresented groups, and this is across the board within higher education, not just the community college system, report greater mental health challenges than their peers. So a couple of things that we talked about were the increasingly hostile political environments that we've seen since the 2016 elections. So the dramatic increase in hate crimes that are targeting immigrant communities, Asian and Asian American communities, queer and trans communities, among others, are all having an effect on our students. And in my latest book that I co-edited with Dr. Susana Munoz, it was called Why They Hate Us. We actually document the research that looks at how this racist political rhetoric has fueled a very hostile climate that's negatively impacting students in K-12 schools and also students in higher ed, where students are also being targeted by hate crimes, increased bullying, discrimination. We talk about other issues around state violence and society's racial reckoning that really got national attention in summer of 2020 with, of course, or the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and other senseless murders of innocent Black people across the nation. And so all of these things go back to the question about harm, right? So I want to be clear about how I'm using the term harm and what that means. And so all of these broader societal issues that I just mentioned and that we discuss in the report do harm to students, right? And when we can talk about the different ways that that happens, that these events and these social inequities have and are having a negative impact on the mental health and the physical health of our students. And research tells us this. So what does it mean when institutions don't view mental health and well-being as their responsibility? It means that they refuse to acknowledge that harm, and that's being complicit.
Thanks, Lindsay. But when we think about students right now, and what's happening on campus right now, I think we can say, we're starting to emerge from the pandemic, and yet, there's still the strain, there's still the stress that has not necessarily been fully addressed from all of what's happened and continues to happen. And so I want to hear from Tiffany a bit. I'll pop you over a stat that you can respond to, but I know you don't need a stat. You have so many daily experiences to respond to, but just in terms of the very contemporary moment, there was a report last year, a survey done by Gallup and the Lumina Foundation that found that more than 40% of students who are currently enrolled have considered dropping out in the past 6 months. And most cited emotional stress and mental health as the reason.
Thank you, April. I think my comments are an extension of Lindsay's in so many ways. I think that was a great overview of the broader picture. And on the ground is I experience the actualization of this every day, is that, students were stressed pre-pandemic. And our students of color, our students were experiencing many different stressors pre-pandemic. And I think that we don't want to admit that we don't really know the full impact of the pandemic. But what we can see is that students are isolated and lonely. And we know that that sort of loneliness and isolation without a community and without support breeds other things that already existed: anxiety, depression, lots of social anxiety, and lots of psychosis. And so I think there's a misconception about what people think about college mental health. People think that, oh, that's where you go to talk about the breakup with your partner. And that's true. That's a lot of what we get, but not the bulk of what we get. And I think that systems and our system in particular, many systems don't acknowledge the fact that there are students with real mental health challenges in our institutions, and that we do have lots of students who are losing touch with reality, experiencing bipolar disorder, psychotic episodes. And this is the age range where that already starts to manifest itself. And I do think that, to Lindsay's point about harm, I think that it's sometimes the institution or academia's neglect of what is really happening, and sort of this displacement of that. It's not my responsibility. Isn't that, the Department of Mental Health? Isn't that, something for your parents who have insurance? Well, our students don't have parents who have insurance, right? And so when we talk about the responsibility and we're looking at community college, state systems, there really is, I think, even more of a responsibility to be in the business of mental health. And I think that's a systemic struggle that institutions are having. I think when we think about the developmental stage of college students, this is the time of life where they're learning themselves, learning to advocate for themselves, learning to have a voice. And so through that process, they're developing a language for mental health. And ideally, if they're developing a language, then that translates to actions and behaviors that are consistent with health in general, if we're doing it right. Without that, students lack the ability to really articulate what's happening for them. And just as an example, a lot of what I see is students come in immediately and they say, I'm so depressed. And I'll say, well, really? You're depressed? Well, what makes you depressed? I just feel terrible. I couldn't get this happening. And it's real. It's real, but it's not depression. But there's a pull to say words that are very strong, very powerful, and words that emphasize how serious it is what I'm feeling, instead of being able to say, I'm really stressed out, and that be validated by a system, valued by a system, and then the system is really able to engage in a solution around being stressed, because that's a real thing. You don't have to be depressed to get help, So I think our role is really around being able to cultivate a language that is that has many words on the spectrum to identify what's happening for college students. And I believe that if we miss this opportunity in college mental health, we will wind up with folks who are, a lot of what Lindsay talked about in her research, people who commit these crimes and commit acts of violence are not well, and don't have the language, and don't have the ability to talk about and explain what is happening for them. And so, and don't experience any kind of mental health. So I think if we don't invest, even in a small way, then that's the outcome of what we get.
Yep. Thank you. I hear you making the case that yes, institutions are responsible. And I think I hear a nuance in there too, especially around, the age of students. This is a developmental stage in life when a lot of, finding yourself at kind of existential, who am I? Questions are being raised as well, whether racial identity, sexual identity, all sorts of things. As well as, sort of the transition to adulthood. But I guess I want to ask, do you think that there's different kinds of institutional responsibility for students who are not that, 18 to 22-year-old age? Like, does institutional responsibility shift for students who are not living on campus?
Mm-hmm.
I think, there's the old-fashioned historical Latin in loco parentis thing, where it's like, if you live on campus, the campus is your home, and now the institution's responsible for you. But now we know that's not the case for so many students here in California. And so I wonder if institutions can maybe buy into a responsibility for 18 to 22-year-olds a little, or the ones who are living in dorms on campuses, maybe. But students who move off campus, or students who live off campus and, commute, or 25 and older, those are not, that's not the responsibility. I'd just be curious how you would respond, Tiffany and Lindsay, to folks who are like, I'm going to draw the line somewhere around
Sure.
responsibility.
Sure. I think you hit the nail on the head, is that when I came to campus, our median age was 35. And so to have this 18 to 22 population is very new. And so I think the issue is about philosophy. And what is our philosophy around college health? And I think that's where the institution has a responsibility. I'm very fortunate to have a president who's a clinical psychologist who understands this world, a VP who's supportive of a holistic community-based model of mental health. And that's very rare on college campuses, where we stick with you with we meet you where you are for the long haul, even in a short-term model. And we're not a conveyor belt, right? We're not a cluster of CBT, a cognitive behavioral treatments that get you to the end. And so the goal, what our belief at Dominguez Hills is that we may only get one shot to see you for therapy. And that may shape your idea of what it means to have mental health for the rest of your life. So if we don't do it well, and we don't invest, and we don't stick it out for a moment, then you may not ever go back. We have lots of students who are parents, lots of students who are taking care of parents, have multiple responsibilities. And so being able to start to get back to an approach where we understand there's community-wide mental health that we have a responsibility to contribute to, but there's also the individual story. So I think we have to push a little bit on our philosophy. I think that's scary for us, to be honest, because I think that if we're not using this community-based systemic model, then the counseling center becomes the only place you get to achieve mental health, and that's not fair. Mental health needs to come from your peers. It needs to come from your faculty members. It needs to come from your family. It needs to come from a whole system that supports mental health. I get you when things are really, really tough. And so I'll stop there and let Lindsay, I'm sure she has some thoughts about that.
And especially as a faculty member, Lindsay, I'm curious, like, what do you hear other faculty are like, that's not my job. I have plenty of other things on my plate. So just on that side of things, curious to your perspective.
Right. I think, it's easy for colleges and universities as a whole, and then, the actors within them, to see mental health as outside their purview. I think, every time there is a crisis or a tragic, like a national tragedy, it's like, well, let's go to CAPS, right? Go to the counseling center. And we're relying on the 18 people in the counseling center to take care of a campus of, we have 40,000 undergraduate and graduate students at our institution, right? And so I think one thing that we need to talk about are the ways that institutions can exacerbate mental health. And so that's something that we talked about in the report, so that we hope showing the ways that institutions can sometimes either be complicit or actually worsen mental health challenges for students, that then they can see how they have a responsibility, right, in taking on mental health as a priority. There's common experiences like the isolation that many students experience, and that is even more prevalent among our historically marginalized communities and our communities of color. And so, we go to college in these competitive and individualistic cultures, which are very different than our home cultures. We experience negative campus racial climates that can be extremely detrimental for students of color over time, who come into an institution and experience things like racial microaggressions on a daily basis at their institution. We see students who, I would say the majority of students on our campus come into college, I think, knowing that they can't fully afford the tuition that it's going to cost for all 4 years, right? And so in the report, we talk about this financial precarity, not just of student debt, but also, students who don't have their basic needs met of housing, of food, who are coming into our campuses and trying to pursue their degrees, although they just don't have these basic needs that they need to survive, right? And so the institution leaves the responsibility for the student to find those resources, to connect to them. And once they do, I think an even bigger problem is that when and if the students finally do connect to their counseling center, to those services, that they are overburdened, like Tiffany was discussing before. So faculty and staff, are counselors and psychologists, are serving thousands, but more likely tens of thousands of students on any one campus. And so sometimes, it makes me think, as I'm doing this report, maybe it's not coincidental that it's so difficult to find these resources, right, for our students, because we just don't have enough people available to give them the help that they need.
I think that it is, I'll take a leap because I think it is institutional, racism that happens. I've been experiencing this on our campus. I was just on a mission to put all the resources in one spot. I've been fighting this for like a year, getting everybody on board, one QR code, one resource, because why is it that we would welcome you to get an education, to, have a legacy for your family, move ahead in life, and then make you run a rat race to figure out how to get all the basic things, the basic rights you're entitled to, and the things you need for success. There's no reason for that, and so I think it's a longstanding practice that no one ever, has taken the opportunity or rarely takes the opportunity to really look at that from a consumer perspective. What would I feel like? I don't want that for myself. And so often on our campus, I'll ask, faculty call or administrators call and they say, well, tell me what's going on. I said, well, can you call the student? I'll say, well, would you want a psychologist to call you? They're like, no, I would want that. And so let me help you figure out how to talk to your student. Let me help you understand what the resources are. I can do my part, but I need a partner in this, or else we are complicit.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, it's not coincidental kind of comment that I think Lindsay made, and then Tiffany, you just named it, institutional racism. What if we had enough resources, for students to actually have all of those things for all, for all the students, the depth of their need, the depth of the supports? It's almost as though by design, we don't want all the students to access all those resources, because the reality is the system was not built for that.
I really appreciate Tiffany's comment about the institutional racism. And I've actually had a student the other day describe this navigational process as Hunger Games. Right? And it's like, it feels like it's a Hunger Game, right? To be able to navigate through higher education, working full-time, right? Family responsibilities. And in this context, we're talking about, some mental health challenges, and it gets to the point where it's overwhelming. And we're talking about the question about societal and inequities in higher education that are in fact by design, right? As you said. And so then, where does that leave our students to, and then they're left feeling that if they don't finally attain this degree, it's their fault, right? It's their fault. And that it's not the institution, the institution didn't have a responsibility to support that student through and make sure that they had the resources and make sure they had access to those resources. And so I think, naming this is really, really important. And again, just really appreciate what Tiffany said about this, because I think it's another way that we talk about institutional responsibility, right? And this issue of being complicit in harm and being complicit in the sometimes, very difficult, negative, challenging experiences that our students have. We know this, like plenty of research tells us this. So, can we do something about it?
I really appreciate the naming piece of it, because even I, just having this conversation, I'm starting to feel honestly the overwhelm, that's like it's so many layers. And yet the naming of what institutions specifically, what is in their locus of control. If we can agree, I think the three of us agree that higher ed institutions are responsible in some ways for college student mental health. I mean, maybe not always, but at least some ways, what is it that they can and should do? Like, what is actually in their locus of control to change or to fix? The QR code example, Tiffany, of like, just put it all in one place, or, expand your services, or, you talked about sort of a community approach to the work. Can you share more about what can be done? What could be tackled for an institution that's actually systemic?
I think, most colleges or most universities have a counseling center. And I think that there was like a movement to make that happen. And then folks were like, we did good. We got our counseling center, right? And then without really thinking through what will be the long-term investment in counseling, right? And then what's the long-term investment in health for your entire campus community? And so I think the philosophy shift that I was, referring to is what we can do. We can create cultures of care within our communities. We can move with compassion. We can talk a little bit about basic needs. And I think that holistic health models are the way to go. We have collapsed basic needs, care, intimate partner violence, stalking, counseling, and health all in one unit. Now that's a small realignment that universities can make. I know that we struggle with change, but I think that those are small philosophies. If you ask any counseling center, what can we do? Everyone's going to say more counselors. Everyone will say that. But we all deep down inside, I'll spill the secret, is that we all know that we will not be able to hire ourselves out of this. There is too much demand. There's too much need. Everybody deserves quality mental health care. Everyone. And so we won't be able to hire ourselves out of it, but we can be committed to reducing our client to student, our student to counselor ratios. We can be committed to other mental health efforts that make sense: outreach, social media outreach, education, awareness, mental health first aid, things that engage your community. Because I found that if students can talk to a peer counselor, and Long Beach has this a very, very robust program, that if you can talk to a peer, then that seems to do it. Our students don't care that they sit on a wait list for a moment. If we call them and we say, we care for you, we're getting right to you, we know it's not a crisis, and they're like, that's fine, someone cares. And so, or their faculty member is saying, have you thought about going to talk to someone? So when when we shift our philosophy and our model, then I think that that's a small step that universities can take. But if we stick to a conveyor belt model, it's not a model of care. And it perpetuates the same sort of idea that you have to jump through the hoops to get to where you want to be, or you've got to be the loudest voice in the room to get something, or complain up the chain, which we know that most students of color are not going to do. And so we'll suffer in silence. And so I think that those are changing the way we do this, providing more culturally appropriate responses that match our students. Then we can, those are small shifts that universities can do that don't cost them a dime.
Well, I'd love to hear, what is the culturally appropriate response?
So I think that if we have a counselor that provides services for our undocumented students. And so we started to do healing circles in their space. And so we go to their space, we have these healing circles, and allow students and allies to really talk about what that experience is like, and talk about the barriers that or the ways that they feel at our institution. That was something that was built out of what students brought to us. Every year we reassess based on what our students say they want. So our students say, our API community wants an API therapist. Well, I may not be able to find that right off the bat, but we can come to your center and talk about what your needs are. And so being able to shape services that are student-centered and student-driven, and then being able to admit when things don't work.
Lindsay, what do you think? I mean, I think I'm hearing from Tiffany, a beautiful, approach that I wish, all students were able to experience in a kind of community of care. From a slightly more critical angle, part of me just wants to, that's all like sounds amazing and positive and healing. And part of me thinks too, well, yes, and maybe just don't do so many harmful things too, that like directly, like we could do less, grading on curves, or, there's plenty of other examples that just actually create the anxiety and stress or administrative burden that students have to face. And so I guess I want to hear, your sort of thoughts from the angle that you come around sort of how colleges can change, what they can do to help students flourish, heal.
I think something that we have to think about institutionally is also what Tiffany reiterated here, is that we first have to recognize that institutions can also be harmful. And higher ed needs to first understand that they play a direct role in the well-being of students, and acknowledging that responsibility. Because without that recognition, we can essentially go nowhere in this conversation about what we can do and how we can move forward. This means that campus leadership, university presidents, provosts, and other upper level administrators prioritize mental health and student well-being as integral to the functions of higher education and to student success. And Tiffany talked a little bit about this earlier. So if that becomes true, then, so if mental health becomes a priority, then there's a lot of exciting things I think we can do to ensure students thrive and heal. This means that the small number of psychologists and counselors on campuses, and I'm reiterating a lot of what Tiffany shared earlier, are no longer seen as the only actors in addressing mental health challenges, and that it becomes an entire campus community effort to play a role in student well-being. So that means when students come into my classroom as a faculty member, I understand that I also play a role in their well-being. And so what am I going to do in my classroom, in my interactions with my students to help, right, foster a positive well-being and positive mental health? Our staff can do that. Our admin can do this. So one thing that we talk about in the report kind of is, how do we think about this concept of collective care? So my co-author, Dr. Samuseas, this is actually from his research, thinking about the ways that we move from these kind of individual strategies of self-care to these strategies of care that have implications for community connections and for broader collective well-being. So this means thinking about how we create, he actually has a model of culturally engaging campus environments, right? So what does this mean at an institutional level to engage in collective care? So some of the ways that we do this is to enable students to make meaningful connections that allow them to feel connected, allow them to feel welcomed at their institutions. And in the way that Sam talks about this model, there's basically two connections that I think are really important that I can highlight just for a moment. One is positive connections to their campus communities. So this is, positive relationships with faculty and staff through things like mentorship, right? That become really, really critical to a sense of belonging, a sense of welcoming, a sense of being a part of a campus community. And peers. And Tiffany mentioned like the significance of, the peer mentoring, the peer counseling that happens in the counseling centers, and just broadening out a little bit, right, to think about how important a peer network, a strong peer network is to students in their everyday college lives. So I'm talking about this work, of course, as a researcher and a scholar, but my oldest daughter, it's her first year in college. And so her first year was very rough, to say the least. Find a better word to describe that, right? I started thinking about the ways that I entered my higher ed institution as an undergrad. I was a first generation college student. I came from a working class family. I was really not prepared to make that transition. And it was, I guess, also very rough for me. But I'm thinking about my daughter and the resources she has now. Having a mom who has an advanced degree, who studies higher ed, all the things. And she starts her first year of college, and I see some of the same patterns happening for her that happened to me when many, many years ago. And her experience has improved. I've just see this amazing viewpoint about her experience and how she feels about her campus and how connected she feels because she's developed a peer group, this second part of the year. And that's just changed everything for her. And so, the research tells us this, but when we see that change that happens, with our students or with our children, it really is, it has such an impact. The other thing is this notion of maintaining connections to communities of origin so that students, when they get to their institutions, they feel that they see themselves in cultural programming, that they see themselves in their courses, that they have spaces they can go to, right? Like there was this, you're talking about this beautiful space of healing circles, Tiffany, with undocumented students, and what it's like for a student to know that space is there for them. It must be really, life-changing, I imagine, for them. And so when institutions reflect and engage the cultural values and identities of students and their families, these college environments become more inclusive, right? They're experienced more inclusively, and that leads to, belonging. So there's a concept that I've been doing I've been working on in some of my research around what we call racial microaffirmations. So racial microaffirmations seeks to name the everyday strategies people of color engage that affirm each other's dignity, integrity, and shared humanity, and can lead to healing. So racial microaffirmations in a higher ed setting would allow students of color and their communities to feel acknowledged, respected, and valued. I think that if we think about how this concept can be useful in how institutions begin to think about how they work with students of color, that they can actually take a role in leading towards more positive mental health outcomes by reducing things like stress and anxiety and creating connections that foster belonging and foster community. So I think, already have some examples of how to do this in higher ed. And one of the things that most colleges and universities have on their campus, either as a program or as departments, is ethnic studies, right? And so ethnic studies centers the histories of communities of color and other minoritized groups and cultivates critical analytical skills and also a critical consciousness. So helps us understand the systemic inequalities that we've seen happen around us and happen to us. So these are culturally relevant by design. But I think it's unfortunate that with the recent attacks on teaching racial issues in education, that, I think ethnic studies is one is very vulnerable right now, right to these attacks. And so I think it's also important that we continue to support these programs that can be so empowering for students.
I wanted to just, you can see my face. You've given me so much to think about. And I just wanted to say this one piece about what I've been worried about lately. And it's really the impact on our faculty and our staff mental health, right? Because I think that we're talking about this from a student perspective. I can say that, most of our ethnic studies departments are very small on our campus and on many campuses. And so the faculty are experiencing a lot of cultural attacks there, in that it is very relational. And so there's the validation on one side, which we need and we want, and it is the foundation of how this is going to work. to Lindsay's point. And then the other piece is how as an institution we're working. And this is a conversation we're having openly on our campus now about cultural taxation and how to start to deal with that. So it's an open conversation, which I find to be so valuable. And I just appreciate the dialogue. But the reality is that these faculty end up shouldering a lot of the burden and what that must feel like for them. And the other reality is that we have all been impacted by the pandemic. And I think that on most of our campuses, none of us are 100%. And so how we are trying to get to a place of health while we're trying to take care of ourselves, our students, our own families. And so I don't want to just, I just want to make sure we give some props to the people who are really supporting this. April and I were talking about this just in terms of attrition in college counseling. We're seeing a lot of movement, folks in and out, because it's tough work. And people are saying, this is not what I want to do anymore. And I think faculty are saying that too, because I have my own life, I have my own family, and I have to deal with yours as well. And it's a lot for me. And so I think the institution also has a responsibility of acknowledging that as well, if we want a healthy, if we want our ecosystem to be healthy as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Who's going to give those micro affirmations if we have folks who are just spent and stretched? I'd love to hear, there's so much to think about. And I have so many questions, but I'd love to hear, are there everyday examples of micro affirmations? I hear you on sort of the systemic ethnic studies departments or cultural centers. Those are kind of, institutionalized programs and spaces. When I think about microaggressions, unfortunately, those are just happening all the time, every day, here, there, everywhere, accumulating and impacting folks. What does it look like to be micro-affirmed?
Can I just say one thing is that we have so many students who talk about their relationship with our custodial staff. And no matter how many surveys we run, it is it's the most amazing thing. And we've come to, as a campus, just start to have conversations about the connection that's made from the parking lot to the classroom. And there's something up with our custodial staff in that they're affirming our students in such a way, and students are talking to our custodial staff in a way that they're getting what they need, those affirmations to be able to move on. And so I think it was something our institution never even really looked at until our students started to speak up and say, at the cultural graduation celebrations, they say I want to thank Mr. Mario, and I want to thank, and you're like, wait, what? And so it's so, I love the idea of the whole community in affirming our students and each other as colleagues.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Tiffany, because we're finding that in our research as well, right? Is the relationships with custodial staff on campus that, being able to engage with people that look like you, that speak the same language, right? It reminds you of home, right? And it makes you feel like you're home, even though you're in this space that can be very isolating and marginalizing.
Yep. Then those are the jobs that your parents might have or your family has. And so the feeling of being judged or the feeling of, measuring up, it maybe is not as present in those dynamics. So I love that. And that's a great example of a conversation that your campuses are having. I'm conscious of time here. And one of the final questions I wanted to ask you all is sort of what are the conversations that we need to be having? What are the ones that we're not having? Or what are the good ones that we need to have more of?
I feel really grateful that we're starting to have some honest conversations about racism, about structural racism, about cultural taxation. And I find that a lot of the conversations we're having now are around how to create a culture of care. And that seems to be in many strategic plans, not just ours, but what does that look like? And really starting to interrogate what that looks like for our campus, and respecting that may look differently on another campus. And how do we do that cross-divisionally? And so that caring and compassion and belonging is not just a student affairs thing. It's an academic affairs thing. It's an admin and finance thing. You know, if I'm going to provide emergency funding to a student who needs something right away, are they able to get the check the same day? Those are practices that we are starting to interrogate. And I think we're having a lot of very tough, I know we're having a lot of very tough conversations and across the divisions about the way we do our work. And I've had our financial aid director, who actually came from Long Beach, Lindsay, who say, like, why are you giving this funding to students in this way? And it was a perfect question. It was the perfect question to make me examine my philosophy to emergency funding for basic needs. What happens when it runs out? What is my responsibility? And I appreciate him for holding me accountable in that way. And then, why are you only providing 4 sessions? Well, no, we're not going to have any more sessions. What does that mean? And so we're challenging each other to really think from a place of care and compassion. It's tough. And sometimes we get a little angry and we're stuck, but I appreciate the kinds of conversations that we're having around care, compassion, and well-being in general.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think, I'll kind of reiterate a couple of points that Tiffany made here as well, around, student success should include the well-being of our students. And so if that's true, then institutional investments should follow, and that we see all actors, all stakeholders on our campuses having a responsibility for mental health and well-being of our students. And so it's not just, right, the ethnic studies professors, and it's not just the CAPS counselors, but that we are all learning tools and strategies to support our students in those ways. And if that becomes true, then we engage, then we're really talking about how to engage in a collective care, right? If we're looking at student success and mental health in that collective way. I think one narrative, kind of taking a step back, one narrative that needs to change is that mental health on campuses is an individual student issue. And so future conversations really need to reframe mental health as a systemic problem that requires systemic change. And so, in the report, Sam and I tried to highlight this and show that systemic inequities have fueled the mental health crisis we see today, that higher education has taken a direct part in contributing to that crisis. And so higher education should share in the responsibility to address it. And I think that, we need more research. A big outcome of the report was just seeing that there was a big disconnect in the scholarship around mental health higher education. So psychology is having a conversation in their scholarship about kind of the individual issues and challenges that are happening with students. And then higher education is still trying to figure out these broader, societal issues and how it matters for higher ed, and then connects to mental health. And so we really need to think about how these kind of disparate scholarship areas can begin to talk to each other. And we hope that this report can help build on that important work that has been done, and to prompt conversations that can address the lack of attention to mental health in higher ed scholarship.
My formal sign off here is, thanking Dr. Tiffany Herbert and Dr. Lindsay Pérez Huber once again for joining me on this episode of Opportunity Forum with College Futures, a conversation space of innovators and influencers in and around public higher education, working to help students move onward and upward. You can find the Degrees of Distress report we referenced on our website at www.collegefutures.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We'll see you next time.